What do you think it means to be a conservative today? Amid the tumultuous politics of the last decade, it's easy to feel constantly stuck in the short-term political fights, fixated on whatever headline or partisan battle dominates the day. But is there a broader, aspirational vision that conservatism can offer to Americans?
The task for conservatives is to make it new, right? To take the timeless principles we're always talking about, but apply them to circumstances that are always changing.
This is the 100th episode of Defending Ideas, so we're taking a special look at the state of conservatism today, where it's headed, and how you and I can become better at making sound ideas broadly popular. And we're joined by special guest Ramesh Ponnuru of National Review. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week, we're very excited to have a special conversation because this is, of course, our 100th episode of Defending Ideas. We're very grateful to you all, the listeners and the viewers of our show, for helping us get to this important milestone. And to commemorate this 100th episode, I'm really excited to welcome into our virtual studio Ramesh Ponnuru. He is the editor for National Review. He's also a non-resident senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute, a columnist for the Washington Post, and he's been an author and a frequent national TV news contributor. And so very grateful to have Ramesh Ponnuru on Defending Ideas. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Ramesh, I'm really excited to talk to you because we wanted to do something a little bit unique and special for this episode in particular. As we look back on the past 100 episodes of Defending Ideas, again, our slogan is renewing the principles of common sense conservatism. We really want to equip our listeners and our viewers to go be constructive, positive, optimistic, and enthusiastic champions of these ideas in a way that's beneficial for the country, in a way that makes our conversations more constructive, and also in a way that can turn down political polarization and contempt in this country while still advocating for sound principle and good idea to really make these ideas broadly popular. So your experience and your expertise in this realm, I think, will be a huge value to our listeners. And I really wanted to start off with just kind of a big picture question and really get your sense of how would you describe the current state of conservatism or the health of the conservative movement today, just in broad terms. Let's start there.
Sure. Great question. And I think the answer to that question depends on where you look. At the state level, I think conservatism is really flourishing. If you look at what's happening in state governance, particularly in the conservative states, you see huge expansions of school choice. The last 3-4 years have been the best years for that movement that it's ever had after, really starting in the brain of Milton Friedman in the early 1960s. State after state is simplifying and reducing its tax codes. We're getting, in many states, even flat taxes. State after state has provided protections for unborn life. And you're seeing all kinds of other sort of smaller scale initiatives. States, including not particularly conservative states, have opened up public sector employment to people who don't have college degrees when those college degree requirements aren't necessary. So you're seeing all kinds of, I think, really beneficial changes of a kind that conservatives have long wanted happen in the states. The picture is more mixed at the federal level. Even there, I think there are some very good things happening, partly because the federal courts, particularly at the Supreme Court and appellate court level, are as solidly constitutionalist as they have been in 3 generations. And that is having ramifications across the policy landscape. For example, very importantly, on the issues related to affirmative action, racial preferences, DEI, The administration, the Trump administration, is doing, I think, some 90% good work on this subject, but it wouldn't be able to do it without the courts having helped pave the way. And of course, the courts importantly owe to the first Trump administration in their orientation. Now, on the question of limiting the size and scope of the federal government, that seems to be a pretty much a disaster right now, where neither party is at all serious about controlling spending, particularly on the entitlement programs that are driving federal spending and its out of control growth. The president is at best indifferent and sometimes in practical ways hostile to the idea of constitutionally limited government and a constitutionally limited executive in a way that I think is pregnant with all kinds of problems that could come up in the near future and more generally be sort of corrosive of our constitutional order and the political culture that needs to sustain it. So a mixed picture. The optimistic way of looking at it is that we've still got a lot of work to do. We're not putting ourselves out of jobs.
Ramesh, why do you think there is that kind of fissure, if you will? Because that resonates with me, that what I see at the state level, especially here in Utah, I mean, we've advanced education choice, some religious freedom legislation, we're engaging in welfare reform. There are a number of areas where Utah at the state level does really well. And as you pointed out, that we've seen a lot of positive trends in states elsewhere in the country. But so to me, that's encouraging. But why do you think there is kind of this difference in the health of the conservative movement today at the state level versus the federal level?
I think that it has to do in part with the difficulty of some federal reforms. There's certainly some thorny issues at the state level, of course, but there's nothing quite comparable to the entitlement problem. And that's sort of, in a way, by design, right? I mean, progressivism and liberalism wanted centralized federal entitlement programs on which large portions of the public depend. And so you've created a kind of monster at the federal level that you don't really have a state level analog to. Secondly, the whole national populist movement, whatever you want to call it, national conservatism, or populism, whatever label you go under, it's all about big, ambitious national projects, and it is really focused on ambitious national policy solutions, whether it be industrial policy or a tariff regime. Big spending, a bureaucracy that is maybe not so much smaller as it is more conservative. And all of those things don't really have state level analogs. Nobody's really running on the idea of sort of making the governor of Utah more powerful.
It's really interesting. And you touch on something that I think maybe helps to get at some of the answer to the question of the health of conservatism today. You mentioned national conservatism. There's also the freedom conservatism movement, and of course the influence of populism that's you've talked about a lot, that's been discussed widely in recent years. And I want to kind of get your thoughts on that, of sort of maybe the different strains within sort of the so-called political right. I think of it in terms of, if you look at from Ronald Reagan to Arthur Brooks. And so, the 80s till about 2015, 2016. And I say Arthur Brooks in large part because the book, The Conservative Heart, came out in 2015. And that was kind of in my view, was a capstone to a conservative movement that was focused on opportunity for Americans that I view as being really essential to the conservative project. But in the decades since that book has come out, of course, there seems to be a lot more tumult, or that maybe fissures or fractures in sort of the coalition on the political right, whether it comes to foreign policy, to trade, at times even on issues of pro-life issues. And so I'd love to kind of just get your thoughts on, can you sort of diagnose for us what do those fissures and fractures look like what has caused them, and how should we be thinking about those now and in the future?
So let's start by talking about conservatism circa 2015 and what I think its weaknesses and flaws were. Although, of course, it had a lot of corresponding virtues. I do think that conservatism was too focused on the struggles of businessmen, including small businessmen, and insufficiently attuned to the economic concerns of people who work for those businessmen. It was insufficiently attuned to the problems that mass immigration can cause for society, and particularly the problem of mass illegal immigration. It repeatedly, at least as instantiated in Republican politics, delivered less than it promised. Kept talking about what would happen after the next election if conservatives won, and then finding reasons why those things couldn't actually be done. And so I think conservatism did need some change, and the flaws in that conservatism helped pave the way for the populist conservatism that is ascendant right now. And I should add, of course, on foreign policy, there was an understandable and justifiable reaction to the idea of overextension abroad and attempts to nation build and spread democracy abroad. I mean, the funny thing about that, or at least the odd thing about that, is, of course, the Iraq War, which is the sort of major exhibit for the idea of foreign policy overreach, wasn't initially motivated by democracy promotion or nation building. We kind of backed into that kind of sweeping justification after the weapons of mass destruction weren't found. But so in all those areas, I think that there was the potential for a healthy correction to aspects of conservatism. But, people being what we are, correction often led to overcorrection. And I think that we have seen that too. I think we have also seen some developments in conservatism that have really been tied to the personality of Donald Trump more than they were to any sort of inelectable ideological movements. So just an example of that, I think the style of American conservatism was bound to change because the conservatism and the Republican Party had been becoming more working class over time before Trump, and he accelerated that, and that's just bound to have all kinds of effects. I don't know that it had to be quite as insulting or outrageous as it has become under Trump, and also things like the way in which a lot of conservatives have sort of turned on a dime and decided that, Canada's always been our enemy. That just seems completely personal to Trump. That's something that he was able to inculcate very rapidly in millions of people.
You bring up an interesting point because as I see it, there are a number of issues, to your point, where there have been, maybe a generous way to describe it, some evolution in thinking among the electorate, as you said, influenced by some of the personality elements of the president. But two of the more recent ones, these are not the only ones, obviously, but two of the more recent ones seem to be the sort of the foreign policy footing, especially with respect to the war in Ukraine with Russia, and then also issues of trade. And, with the current debate over tariffs, we did a podcast episode recently on the tariff issues specifically. And even I remember even in the election, some issues around right to life. And as you mentioned, some of the constitutional issues. And so it seems like there are a couple of threads where that effect that you're articulating have manifested. So I guess number one, I'd love your thoughts on are those kind of some of the key drivers of some of these changes? And are they largely motivated by this sort of populist sentiment? And then maybe a way to kind of couch that question is, circa 2015, would you say that conservatism at large was not quite populist enough? But fast forward to now, and it is kind of, as you said, overcorrected. Maybe it's become too populist, that there's got to be a way that we can be responsive to some of the questions and concerns and genuine sentiments that Americans are feeling, while not becoming unmoored from core constitutional principles or core civic institutions. Help us kind of navigate that.
I think that when conservatism has been successful as a political and governing movement, it has married kind of, more thoughtful and empirical conservative philosophy with populist energy. I mean, I think that is true, for example, of the Reagan presidency. And that when you don't have either one of those, you're hobbled in different ways. Either you don't have the kind of popular support that you need, or you don't have a great sense of what to do with that support. On trade, let me make a more general point here. I do think that in part, people on all sides of these conservative debates and outside the conservative world mistake the immediate pre-Trump conservative movement and Republican Party for the conservative movement and Republican Party that had existed for decades previously. So the immediately pre-Trump party was a more rigidly anti-government party, more pro-entitlement reform, and more pro-free trade party than, say, the party of the 1980s. And I'm not saying that, to make any value judgments about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but it just is the case that the Republican Party of the 1980s was not particularly hostile to entitlement programs, which were also, of course, smaller back then. And Reagan did, in fact, impose tariffs on a lot of different goods in different countries. Now, what happened over time, the party kind of purified and became a little bit more rigid on those issues. And possibly that was a little unhealthy. Like there's probably should have been a stronger protectionist wing of the Republican Party, even 15 years ago. But what's happened but there's been the real change here is not that we've moved from dogmatically free trade to an ability to support tariffs in some instances. We've moved to a kind of dogmatic protectionism that doesn't make any distinctions. It isn't particularly tailored toward any strategic purpose or even really economic purpose. It's trying to pursue 10 goals at once, even though they conflict. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with a couple things. First, the Republican Party voters and voters in general were never particularly free trade oriented. And so they were open to protectionist appeals, particularly sort of small scale or targeted protectionist appeals. Let's save this particular industry that's in danger. Let's deal with this particular country that is treating us unfairly. And then there were people who were open to a more wide-scale kind of protectionism if the leader that they trusted on other issues was making the case for that, which is obviously what's happened with Trump. But when you see this kind of broad-scale protectionism, you also see this massive public reaction against it, which includes a lot of conservatives. And there's a reason, I think, in politics as well as in markets that Trump has retreated from his most extreme version of protectionism.
Ramesh, what would you say is going to be the long-term effect of President Trump on the conservative movement, on the GOP specifically? And I'll preface that by saying that regardless of how people feel about the current president, whether they're fans or not, whether they're on the political right or not, I think there's no dispute that he has had tremendous effect on our politics as a nation, broadly speaking, and on the Republican Party and on the conservative movement. And I'm very curious as to what you think will be that long-term effect, because there's a lot of energy around his personality as sort of a driving factor in our current politics. And at some point in the future, he will not be on the public national political stage the way he is now, obviously. And so when that happens, kind of what happens to, either to what degree is his impact lasting or not? And then what does conservatism look like then and into the future?
Well, that remains to be seen, and it's one of the reasons why it's important for conservatives of all stripes to engage in these debates. I certainly hope that the combativeness that we've seen under Trump is carried over into a post-Trump party. I would like it to be not the search for fights for the sake of fights, but for the sake of achieving concrete victories. I don't particularly think that Trump's battles with successful Republican governors, for example, have been useful for conservatism or for the American public. I would like to see the return to a controlled border, but I don't want to see family separation. I'd like to see a more practical approach than sort of talking about mass deportations and then not doing a whole lot of interior enforcement, which is what we're seeing. But I think that the post-Trump Republican Party should be less tolerant of open borders than the pre-Trump party. On trade, I think a willingness to use tariffs and other kinds of trade barriers, in particular areas where the cost-benefit analysis has been done carefully, is worthwhile. But I also think that we should see the general interest in free trade and make tighter trade alliances with countries that are our friends. I would like to see a party or a conservative movement that is focused on the economic concerns of people who are not necessarily in the C-suite, but actually achieve something for these workers and doesn't just sort of buy them off with empty promises, which is, I think, a lot of what we're seeing again on the trade issue. So I think it's a matter of sort of separating the wheat from the chaff, and coming up with, a new version of that traditional marriage of populism and conservatism that speaks to contemporary circumstances.
Ramesh, is this basically reform conservatism? I've heard you use that term, talk about it, write about it. Is reform conservatism kind of that vision that you just described? That the way I would describe it, based on hearing you articulate that, is we want conservatism to still bring its anchoring values, the constitutional framing, the importance of our civic institutions, again, kind of those bedrock values, but then deploy it to address the modern concerns that some might call populist. That's sort of the focus of it. Is that sort of how you would articulate, well, a reform conservatism would do this, or is it a little bit different than that?
I think that's right. The task for conservatives is to make it new, right? To take the timeless principles we're always talking about, but apply them to circumstances that are always changing. And so sometimes people will talk about conservatism as though the program of the 1980s was sort of the last word. And circumstances have changed partly because of the victories of the conservatism of that era. And there was, people use the slogan of zombie Reaganism. And there's a lot to admire in Reagan. There's a lot to admire in his approach to politics. But of course, Reagan didn't in 1979 campaign on the problems of 1959. He campaigned on the particular circumstances which he found. In fact, people always forget this about Reagan's first inaugural address. The famous quote, "The government is not the solution, government is the problem." The beginning of that sentence was, "in this present crisis." So government is not always the problem, and it's not always the problem in the same way when it is a problem. And pre-Trump conservatives sometimes lost sight of that. And that's why, yes, I do think sort of reform conservatism is just sort of updated conservatism, a conservatism that speaks to the problems and challenges we have today.
I want to throw out a thesis and see if it's an appropriate kind of layer to tack on to the reform conservatism vision you just outlined, or if it's kind of already embedded in your view. And that's this, that from my perspective, there are a number of policy areas where folks to the right of center have kind of never really suited up or have not
Absolutely.
kind of been on the field in a significant way. Big ones in my mind are poverty and upward mobility, kind of housing and homelessness policy, mental health, family policy, and especially with respect to childcare and early childhood development. There are probably more, but those are some of the areas that come to mind for me that maybe we would think of traditionally as kind of owned by the political left. And even if you walk into settings where people are talking about poverty and upward mobility, often, I'm in a lot of those spaces just because a lot of the work we do here at Sutherland, and in certain circumstances, I look around and I think I'm pretty sure I'm the only conservative in the room. And what I hope for is we want both the right and the left, the best minds engaging these issues, but there seem to be a slate of issues that the right has not suited up for sufficiently.
Absolutely. We have ceded far too much ground on a lot of issues and partly that is a reflection of priorities that I have to change with circumstances. I think a great example of this is higher education. So think about the higher education landscape at the time that Reagan took over. You had rapidly growing college enrollment, and it seemed to be working as a ladder to opportunity. What's happened since then? Well, the costs have increased. The efficacy of a strategy of pouring more money and more kids into the system reached a point of diminishing returns and then arguably negative returns. And these institutions changed themselves. They became, they went from being institutions that leaned left to institutions that were kind of ideological monocultures. And all of those things, I think, necessitated a greater attention on higher education as a policy area in need of reform, and a different stance towards colleges. And I think we are seeing that. We're seeing that to some degree in the Trump administration. We're seeing it to some degree outside the Trump administration, particularly in the states. Housing is another area that you mentioned. Well, as you know, as everybody I think knows, restrictions on housing supply have had more and more pinch in the U.S. economy. And so it should be a bigger priority than it was in 1980, when it really was not, within the top 30 issues that conservatives had on their minds.
Ramesh, what should be sort of the call to action on those specific issues for conservatives that even sometimes in past jobs, I had colleagues that would, in a very good-natured way, years ago, but long before I came to work at Sutherland, that would sort of tease me as well. Nick, you're the conservative among us who cares about poverty, and they were just being good-natured and everything. But I think that the conservative ethos, which really, honestly, I would describe as sort of Americanism in many ways, and here at Sutherland, in fact, we recently, within the last handful of months, we put out a statement of principles to kind of articulate, here's what we stand for at Sutherland. And we clarify in there that some folks might call these principles conservative, some might call them just sort of American principles. But because it really is anchored to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, both the structure and the principles embedded in those documents, coupled with the recognition of the importance of our institutions of civil society, such as faith and families and the free enterprise system, that those things woven together, and I like what you're saying, we need to deploy those to the challenges and the concerns of the day today. But in a lot of ways, that could almost be described as Americanism, for lack of a better term, as much as conservatism. And I guess what's the call to action either to people who do consider themselves conservative to engage in those issue areas where maybe we haven't been as engaged? How should we go about doing that? And then the second sort of call to action or pitch, if you will, to Americans all over the political spectrum, that this is not about sort of a polarized red versus blue kind of combatant situation. It's about grounding American principles. We want to make sound ideas broadly popular. How do we do that now and moving forward?
Look, sometimes you just have to have a fight politically, right? There are red versus blue issues where I think it's generally pretty important that the red side prevails. But we should, I think it's Frederick Douglass, right, who says, work with anyone to do good and work with no one to do bad. And we'll have shifting coalitions. The people that we work with on tax reform may not be the people that we work with on housing. What you were saying reminded me of something that Steve Hayward, the biographer who's written The Age of Reagan, pointed out to me years ago, which is that Reagan rarely made his public pitch on the basis of how conservative he was. It was never vote for me because I'm a rock solid conservative. It was vote for me because I've got all of these great ideas and I'm going to do these things for the country, which, by the way, happen to be conservative. And I think that in a lot of cases, that is the approach that we ought to take. Although, of course, it's going to depend on the audience that you're speaking to.
How would you deploy or not deploy, I guess, branding language, to put it maybe in kind of simplistic terms, around sort of the batch of ideas that you're espousing? What I mean by that, a while back we had John Hood on the show, who was one of the architects of the freedom conservatism movement. And I asked him the question of, why did you guys choose that term? Why did you feel like you needed a term, and why did you choose that term specifically? And what he said was really interesting to me, that in his view, and encourage folks to go back and listen to that discussion, that in order to really have a movement that can create a sort of broad governing coalition, you need to name it somehow so people can kind of rally under that banner. I'm curious as to your take on that. Is that valuable, not valuable, or does it just kind of depend on the environment that you might be deploying that kind of thing?
Yeah, when reform conservatism was a little bit more at the forefront of the debate and the news, we dealt with this question, and I wondered about it. Partly, the advantage of having that label was, a kind of media buzz, really. Like it gives people something to talk about. But I was always concerned that it made it sound like, we were just like a faction wanting to take over at the expense of other factions. And I wanted to show that this was a kind of mindset about how you do conservatism that could be attractive to conservatives who had different emphases and different interests. On freedom conservatism versus national conservatism, I have, as you may not be surprised to hear, given the tenor of our conversation so far, I have a little bit of a foot in both camps. I mean, I signed the Freedom Conservative Statement, and with some modifications, I probably would have signed the main National Conservative Manifesto, because I think each of them is making points that it's important to remember and that people sometimes forget. So in the case of the Nat Cons, if you look at that statement, I do think sovereignty is important. The nation is important. A national sense of shared belonging and coherence matters. Families matter, and their health is important to the health of the republic. But I do think the Nat Cons are insufficiently appreciative in many cases of the importance of free markets and the many ways in which centralized and intrusive government can go wrong. And that's why I think that the free cons bring something to the table. And I think conservatism at its best acts on the insights of both of these sides and doesn't lose sight of the insights of the other.
Ramesh, is there a way to sort of bundle these ideas together? I like what you said about President Reagan, that he didn't sort of invoke the specific labels all the time when he was speaking publicly. And I wonder if a way to talk about these kinds of principles is we want more Americans to feel like the American dream is within their grasp. And obviously that comes down to work and being able to afford your home and the things you need for your family. It refers to healthy and stable families. It refers to the ability of faith organizations to flourish in our society, the free enterprise system, a constitutionally bounded government. I mean, you can kind of go down the list and say, we're about the American dream, and to your point, maybe that happens to be as we may articulate conservative, but is that a better way to approach it if we're talking to broad audiences that you want to achieve the American dream, we want to help you do that. We're all about addressing the barriers in your way. Is that a better elevated maybe message?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is the way to talk to voters, particularly many voters, the vast majority of voters who don't really think in ideological terms, but think in more practical terms and often in sort of more localized and concrete terms, having to do with their own interests. So you don't say we're going to cut taxes. You say we're going to cut taxes because it'll help you achieve your dreams. The one thing I would say about the American dream that I think is important that conservatives sometimes lose sight of is that it shouldn't be defined in purely material terms, but particularly in terms that have to do with building families and having healthy communities, because there has been a strain of free market advocacy, which acts as though A, everybody just wants to get rich, and B, that everybody sees their career, their work life as sort of central to their identity, and that's just not the case. A lot of people they hold jobs in order to provide for their families, and they're not looking to be revolutionary innovators. And I think particularly the sort of circa 2012 Republican Party had this kind of Randian rhetoric that made it sound as though, there's nothing. Most people just wanted to start their own small businesses and then become billionaires. And it's, and that's just a really distorting frame to think about the American dream.
I think that captures well maybe some of the disconnect between at times sort of the economic elite class, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. I mean folks looking at GDP and job growth and aggregate wages and things like that, because we faced this during the Biden administration when inflation was really high and people were feeling a lot of consternation about it, rightfully so. And we actually had a podcast episode talking about how a lot of economists were kind of saying, well, when you look at the numbers, things are actually going really well. Like, what are you guys so worried about? And one, I think there was a disconnect just in pure economic terms. But to your point, we miss something really important as whether we call ourselves conservatives or champions of the American dream when we only look at the material. Because when I look at my, the measure of a day in my life, of course, I love what I get to do for work. I feel very grateful for it. And I do derive meaning and satisfaction out of the things we get to do in a professional setting. But also I go home to my wife and two little boys. And on Sundays I go to church and I get to spend time with my family, and I'm in a community that's safe and healthy. And so to your point, I think it's really important that we recognize the American dream as a bundle of things, many of which large swaths of Americans feel like is slipping a little bit, is eroding. Economic growth is one of those. So that seems like a really important message we're missing at times.
Well, GDP matters enormously, and it's correlated with a lot of things that we care about more directly, like a healthy labor market, where people can find jobs and as we've been saying, provide for their families. But it's not everything. GDP isn't everything. And what I was saying earlier, I don't want to be mistaken. The story of the heroic entrepreneur who's stifled by taxes and regulation and needs to be liberated to transform the economy for the better, that's an important and resonant conservative story, but it's not the only one. And we can't act as though we think it's the only one.
Ramesh, we've got just a couple minutes left. I wish we could keep going, but we want to be respectful of your time. I just would love to have you on again in the future. But the last question or two I have as we start to close out, number one, I'd want to know what you think the role is of institutions that are typically viewed as conservative. I mean, obviously, your role as editor for National Review, very influential institution in the world of conservative thought, and also your capacity at the American Enterprise Institute. So what do you see as the important role of institutions, whether it's in media like National Review or think tanks like AEI, or of course here at Sutherland here in Utah?
Well, so I tend to think of conservatism as being involved in the conservation of our civilizational inheritance, and more specifically in the United States, our political inheritance from the founders. That is a gigantic task. And as we know from Burke, conservation is not merely a passive activity. It requires constant work because you're always in danger of internal decay or external attack. And so there are many fronts on which we have to make that defense and we have to engage in that renewal. And different institutions have different roles to play in that. So a state level think tank will be dealing with the state issues that are necessary to work for the betterment of the people of that state. Within that kind of broad philosophical and constitutional framework. One think tank might be oriented towards national security and, really focused on that question of defending ourselves from external attack as part of American Enterprise Institute is, right? The Foreign and Defense Policy Studies wing of the Institute. So different organizations have different roles to play, and that has to do with their interests, their expertise, what they're good at, and I think it's worthwhile letting 1,000 flowers bloom, if that's not a bad metaphor given the historical context. And also, we have to understand, these are difficult questions, right? How best to promote flourishing families. People who have the basic same philosophical premises can disagree about the practical answers to those questions. And a healthy conservatism is going to be constituted in part by a continuing, vital, hopefully civil disagreement and argument about those matters where we get closer and closer to better and better answers. And so I think it really depends, and I think it's appropriate that conservatism not be a top-down, centrally planned enterprise, but one that is a kind of vast, blooming, exciting patchwork.
Ramesh, last question for you. I'll do my usual kind of elevator question. You're in an elevator and in walks your average right-of-center voter. Say, hey, you're Ramesh Ponnuru. You're great. I love all the ideas that we talk about as far as the things we want to preserve and protect and advance in America. But if they ask you, I feel a little stressed or worried or frustrated, the state of our politics, the direction of our country, I want to stand up for the things that I believe in. And if they just say, Ramesh, what's your advice? What should I do? How can I do it? What do I need to be doing as an American who cares about these ideals now and in the future?
Well, first I'd say thank you. And second, I would want to know a little bit more about what their particular concerns are. Maybe what they're concerned about above all is how our educational system and our culture are failing at teaching kids about American ideals, the American system, why it works, why it's great. Maybe their concerns are about the U.S. losing ground in competition with China. Maybe they're both, but maybe there's a particular set of things that really concerns them. Maybe it's the impending bankruptcy of the country. And my advice would be different depending on what their answer to that question is. But it certainly would encourage them not to lose heart, to remember that Americans have faced very serious challenges before and come through them, and that we've got a lot of assets in our country, from an educated and public-spirited population to a constitutional system that, although it is somewhat encrusted under a lot of progressive barnacles, still has life left in it. And then, of course, I would tell them to subscribe to National Review.
Well, I'm a big fan of National Review. Enjoy reading, and the articles and the podcast is great. The editor's podcast, and I've written some things as a contributor to National Review as well. So I endorse that. A great institution, of course, American Enterprise Institute as well. Another great institution that we work with very well and closely here at Sutherland. Ramesh, we will leave it there. There's so much more to talk about, so we'll have to have you back on at some point in the future. But really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us here on Defending Ideas.
Thanks very much.
Well, we're going to take a break before we leave you with some final talking points. Once again, that was Ramesh Ponnuru, editor of National Review and non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. We'll be right back after this. This is Defending Ideas.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. Before I share some final thoughts from our discussion with Ramesh Ponnuru, I want to thank you for watching, listening, and sharing Defending Ideas, because today we're celebrating our milestone of 100 episodes, which is a really big deal. The focus of the show is evident in the name, Defending Ideas, because we want to equip you to become a more effective champion of sound ideas. And so today's special discussion with Ramesh, bringing his insights from National Review and American Enterprise Institute, offered a chance to reflect on the past 100 episodes and lay some groundwork for some of what we hope to accomplish in the next 100 episodes. It's so easy to get fixated on the short-term, hyper-partisan political fights that dominate headlines and social media. But I think it's really important for us to occasionally take a step back and look at the big picture and ask these questions. What are we for? What does it mean to live the American dream? And how can you and I be part of the policy discussions and the coalitions to improve the key aspects of our country that make the American dream within reach for more of our fellow Americans? Here's a very rough game plan to help us start to do that. First, keep a focus on the big picture. The political fight of the day can be consequential, and at times I think you and I do need to suit up for those fights. But we should always remain fixed on our North Star, the thing that we aspire to in the future for our movement, for our country, and orient our current debates accordingly. Second, we should argue for something. Too often these days, I feel like if you ask somebody what they think about a particular issue, the first words out of their mouth will be a rebuke of the other side, as if to say, well, I'm against what that team is doing. We need to stop doing that. You and I should become experts at articulating a positive, aspirational vision that can further secure our constitutionally protected rights, bolster opportunity and upward mobility for all Americans, and facilitate the flourishing of our institutions of civil society. Because all of that leads to the flourishing of our people. And third, remember that your fellow Americans, wherever they fall on the political spectrum, aren't going anywhere. So we should take their concerns seriously, disagree where we must, but build consensus where we can. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Well, thanks again for joining us on this 100th episode of Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.